How does a quiet father go from being erased at his own daughter's party to sending a single envelope that changed her life forever? When I saw her friends dismiss me as the old man, I realized exactly how invisible I'd become, and what power I still held. The moment she opened my envelope, everyone in the room finally understood what I had always known. The morning of Madeline's 24th birthday party, I stood in my modest apartment kitchen, carefully wrapping the small jewelry box I'd chosen for her. It wasn't much, a delicate silver bracelet with her birthstone, but I'd spent weeks selecting it, hoping it might bridge the growing distance between us. The card took me even longer to write. 3 drafts sat crumpled in the wastebasket before I settled on something simple. Happy birthday, sweetheart. I'm proud of the woman you've become. Love always, Dad. Douglas Carver, 58 years old, financial consultant at a mid-tier firm downtown, divorced father trying to maintain a relationship with a daughter who seemed increasingly embarrassed by my existence. That's how I'd describe myself to a stranger, though the reality felt more complicated. Madeline had been the center of my world for 24 years, from the moment I first held her tiny fingers in the hospital nursery. Now, conversations between us lasted maybe 5 minutes, usually about money or logistics. I practiced what I'd say to her on the drive over. Happy birthday, honey. You look beautiful. Thank you for including me. Simple, non-intrusive. The kind of thing that wouldn't embarrass her in front of her friends. I'd learned to make myself small at these gatherings, to hover at the edges and leave early. It wasn't what I wanted, but it seemed to be what she needed. The elevator in my office building had been acting up all week, and naturally it chose today to trap me between the 3rd and 4th floors for 20 minutes. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the mechanical humming and the occasional creak of cables. I checked my phone for the time, 7:30 p.m. Madeline's party had started at 7, and I was already fashionably late in the worst possible way. That's when the notifications started buzzing, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all lighting up my phone screen with alerts about Madeline's posts. I rarely checked social media. It felt like intruding on her private world, but trapped in that metal box with nothing else to do, I opened Instagram. The first post was a group photo. Madeline, radiant in a flowing emerald dress, surrounded by her usual crowd of 20-something friends at the upscale downtown bar she'd chosen for the celebration. The caption read, "Birthday vibes with my favorite people. Looks like the old man changed his mind. More champagne for us?" The old man. That's what I'd become to her. Not Dad, not Douglas, not even my name. Just the old man who might or might not show up to his own daughter's birthday party. I scrolled down to the comments, my chest tightening with each word. Brianna Foster, Madeline's best friend since college, had written, "Ignore him, keep dancing, your night, your rules." My daughter's reply appeared below it. Honestly, we shouldn't have invited him at all, already regretting that choice. But you're right, not letting anyone ruin the vibe tonight. The elevator lurched back to life, but I didn't move when the doors opened on the 4th floor. I stood there, reading and rereading those words until the doors closed again and the elevator continued its journey. Shouldn't have invited him at all. Already regretting that choice. 24 years of soccer games and school plays, of staying up all night when she had pneumonia at age 7, of working double shifts to pay for her college tuition. 24 years of being the man who chose to love her, raise her, call her his daughter, and I'd become someone whose absence would be celebrated with champagne. By the time I reached the restaurant, my hands weren't shaking anymore. A strange calm had settled over me as I walked through the door, gift bag in hand, prepared to play my role one last time. The hostess directed me toward the private dining area Madeline had reserved. Through the glass partition, I could see the party in full swing. 30 or so people, all young, all laughing, all part of a world that clearly didn't include me. Madeline stood at the center, animated and glowing, telling some story that had everyone hanging on her words. I approached the group slowly, waiting for a pause in the conversation. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said, holding out the gift bag. Madeline turned, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Annoyance? Embarrassment? She recovered quickly, forcing a smile. "Oh, Dad, you made it after all." "Sorry I'm late. Elevator trouble." I gestured toward the gift. "I hope you like it." She took the bag without opening it, setting it aside on a nearby table already crowded with presents. "Thanks. Everyone, this is my dad, Douglas." A few polite nods, a couple of half-hearted, "Nice to meet yous?" And then the conversation immediately shifted back to whatever they'd been discussing before my interruption. I recognized most of these faces from previous gatherings. Brianna, of course, with her perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. Trevor, the aspiring filmmaker who always seemed to be promoting some project. Cleo and her boyfriend Marlo, both working in marketing and constantly taking photos for their social media presence. I found an empty chair at the edge of the group and sat down, nursing the beer someone had half-heartedly offered me. For the next hour, I existed in a strange bubble of isolation, surrounded by laughter and conversation, but completely separate from it. When someone addressed me directly, it was usually to ask what I did for work or make polite small talk about the weather. The server, a young woman probably close to Madeline's age, kept glancing at me with sympathetic eyes as she cleared away my untouched appetizer. She seemed to understand what the others couldn't see, that I was a guest at my own daughter's party, tolerated but not wanted. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. Another Instagram post from Madeline, a photo of her and Brianna raising champagne flutes, both beaming at the camera. The caption read, "Best night ever. No drama, just good vibes with the people who matter most. Blessed, under 24 and thriving squad goals." I stared at that phrase. No drama. As if my presence, the presence of the man who'd raised her, loved her, sacrificed for her, would constitute drama. As if I was some kind of problem to be managed rather than her father celebrating her birthday. The photo had already accumulated dozens of likes and comments. Brianna had written, "You deserve all the happiness in the world, babe. Here's to cutting out the negativity." Madeline's response, "Exactly. Life's too short for people who don't appreciate what they have. Time to focus on the ones who actually show up." The irony wasn't lost on me. I had shown up. I'd been showing up for 24 years. But apparently showing up physically wasn't enough anymore. There was some other kind of showing up I was supposed to do, some way of being present that I'd never learned. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked around the table one more time. Madeline was in the middle of another animated story, her hands gesturing wildly as she described some workplace drama. Her friends hung on every word, laughing at all the right moments, offering supportive comments and validation. This was her world now. Young, ambitious, social media savvy people who spoke the same language and shared the same references. I was a relic from an earlier chapter of her life, kept around out of obligation rather than affection. I finished my beer, left $40 on the table to cover my portion of the bill, and quietly gathered my jacket. No one noticed me leave except the sympathetic server, who gave me a small, understanding nod as I passed her station. Outside, the cool evening air felt like a relief after the suffocating atmosphere of forced cheerfulness. I walked slowly back to my car, my phone buzzing intermittently with more social media notifications that I no longer bothered to check. 24 years of fatherhood, and this was what it had come to, being the old man whose absence would be celebrated with champagne, the man whose own daughter publicly regretted inviting him to her birthday party. But as I drove home through the quiet streets, something else began to stir beneath the hurt and humiliation. A cold, calculating awareness of exactly what I'd been to this family all these years. And more importantly, what I still controlled that they knew nothing about. Madeline thought she knew the whole story. She thought she understood the dynamics of our family, the source of her security, the foundation of her future. She thought I was just the old man who wrote the checks and attended the obligatory events. She had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I sat in my apartment with a cup of coffee and 24 years of memories that suddenly looked very different in the harsh light of last night's revelation. How had I gotten here? When had I stopped being dad and become the old man? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos from Madeline's party that were now flooding social media. Picture after picture of her laughing with friends, posing with gifts, celebrating her birthday. I appeared in exactly none of them, despite being there for over an hour. It was as if I'd been digitally erased from my own daughter's celebration. But it hadn't always been this way. I drove across town to the house I used to call home, the place where I'd raised Madeline until the divorce 2 years ago. Sylvia still lived there with her sister's family temporarily, and I had a standing invitation to visit whenever I wanted to see Madeline. The invitation felt increasingly hollow these days, but I still had keys, and I needed to pick up some old photo albums I'd left behind. The house felt different now, smaller somehow, less like home and more like a museum of a life I used to live. I found the albums in the den, thick leather-bound books that documented every stage of Madeline's childhood. As I flipped through the pages, I remembered why I'd fought so hard to be her father. November 15th, 1999. St. Mary's Hospital, 3:47 a.m. I was 24 years old, barely more than a kid myself, when the nurse placed that tiny, red-faced bundle in my arms for the first time. Madeline Elizabeth Carver, 6 pounds, 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and the strongest grip I'd ever felt. Sylvia was exhausted, barely conscious after a difficult labor, and I found myself alone with this perfect little person who would depend on me for everything. I remember making a promise to her in that quiet hospital room. I would be the father she deserved, no matter what it cost me. The circumstances of Madeline's birth had been complicated. Sylvia and I had only been dating for 8 months when she discovered she was pregnant. She'd been honest about her uncertainty regarding the father. There had been someone else, briefly, during a rough patch in our relationship. But when the other man disappeared completely, refusing to take any responsibility, I made a choice that seemed simple at the time. I chose to love this child as my own. We married quickly, quietly, with just our immediate families present. I adopted Madeline legally, gave her my name, and threw myself into fatherhood with the intensity of a man trying to prove something to the world, maybe to myself. The early years were beautiful. I have hundreds of photos of Madeline's first steps, first words, first day of school, me reading bedtime stories, teaching her to ride a bike, cheering from the sidelines at soccer games. I was present for everything, every scraped knee, every nightmare, every small triumph. But looking at these photos now, I began to notice something I'd missed before. In the later albums, as Madeline grew older, I appeared less frequently. By the time she reached high school, most of the photos showed her with Sylvia, or with friends, or alone. I was still there, still involved, still paying for everything, but somehow I'd become background noise in my own daughter's life. I remembered the exact moment I realized how far I'd fallen in her estimation. Last summer, at a family barbecue at Sylvia's sister's house, I'd been manning the grill when Madeline approached with Brianna in tow. "Dad, can you give me some money for gas?" she'd asked, barely looking up from her phone. "Sure, sweetheart. How much do you need?" "Like 50? Brianna and I want to drive to the outlets." I'd pulled out my wallet and handed her the cash, expecting maybe a thank you or at least acknowledgement. Instead, she'd pocketed the money and turned back to Brianna without another word. "Thanks, ATM," Brianna had said with a laugh, thinking she was being clever. Madeline had giggled. "Right? So convenient." They'd walked away, already deep in conversation about shopping plans, leaving me standing there with a spatula in my hand and the sudden understanding that I'd become nothing more than a source of funding to them. That night, I'd tried to talk to Sylvia about it. "Don't you think Madeline could be a little more grateful, a little more respectful?" Sylvia had sighed, that particular sigh she reserved for when she thought I was being overly sensitive. "She's young, Douglas. She's figuring out her independence. You can't expect her to be your little girl forever." But it wasn't about wanting her to stay little. It was about basic human decency, about treating the people who love you with some measure of respect and consideration. When had those expectations become unreasonable? I closed the photo albums and walked through the house one more time, remembering all the sacrifices I'd made to build this life. The promotion I'd turned down because it would have required relocating when Madeline was in middle school. The vacation I'd canceled to pay for her senior trip to Europe. The countless nights I'd worked late to afford her college tuition, her car, her apartment deposit after graduation. In the garage, I found the boxes I'd been looking for. Old financial records, legal documents, and family papers I'd stored here during the divorce. I loaded them into my car, along with the photo albums, and drove to my apartment to examine everything more carefully. That evening, I spread the documents across my dining room table like pieces of a puzzle I was finally ready to solve. Birth certificates, adoption papers, insurance records, and at the bottom of one box, a manila envelope I hadn't opened in years. Inside were the results of a DNA test I'd taken when Madeline was 5 years old. I'd never told Sylvia about the test. It wasn't that I doubted my love for Madeline or my commitment to being her father. That had never wavered. But I'd wanted to know the truth, wanted to understand the complete picture of our family's foundation. The results had confirmed what I'd suspected. I was not Madeline's biological father. At the time, the knowledge hadn't changed anything. Madeline was my daughter in every way that mattered. I'd raised her, loved her, been there for every important moment of her life. Biology seemed irrelevant compared to the reality of our relationship. But now, sitting in my quiet apartment with those test results in my hands, I began thinking about other documents I still had. Specifically, the family trust my father had set up before his passing 10 years ago. Richard Carver had been a meticulous man, a successful businessman who'd built a considerable fortune through careful investments and real estate ventures. When he'd drafted the trust that would eventually pass his wealth to the next generation, he'd included very specific language about beneficiaries. The trust required direct biological descent from Richard Carver to qualify for inheritance. At the time, it had seemed like a standard legal precaution, the kind of clause lawyers included to prevent disputes or claims from distant relatives. My father had known about Madeline's parentage. I'd been honest with him from the beginning, but he'd loved her as his granddaughter and had always spoken about her future inheritance as a given. But legal documents don't care about love or intention. They care about precise language and verifiable facts. I pulled out my phone and scrolled back through Madeline's social media posts from the previous night, reading the comments again with fresh eyes. Life's too short for people who don't appreciate what they have. Time to focus on the ones who actually show up. The irony was breathtaking. She had no idea what she actually had, or how precarious her assumptions about the future really were. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sylvia. Madeline says you left her party early last night. She's planning another celebration next weekend. Dinner at that new loft space downtown. She wants to make sure you're included this time. I stared at the message for a long moment, understanding exactly what it meant. Madeline felt guilty about last night. Not because she'd hurt me, but because she'd been publicly rude in a way that might have social consequences. This dinner was her attempt to manage the situation, to ensure that no one could accuse her of being a bad daughter. I typed back a simple response. I'll be there. But as I hit send, I was already planning something very different from what Sylvia and Madeline expected. I wouldn't be attending this dinner as the grateful, forgiving father who was thankful for whatever scraps of attention his daughter chose to throw his way. I would be attending as Douglas Carver, executor of the Carver Family Trust, with some very important information to share. Monday morning at the office felt different. I sat at my desk reviewing quarterly reports and fielding calls from clients, but my mind kept drifting to the conversation I needed to have with my brother-in-law, Ethan Foster. Ethan was a family lawyer, married to Sylvia's younger sister, and he'd handled some of the paperwork when I'd adopted Madeline years ago. More importantly, he was one of the few people who knew the complete details of my father's trust. My colleague, Warren Fletcher, stopped by my cubicle around 10:30, coffee in hand, and his usual Monday morning complaints ready to share. How was your weekend, Doug? Please tell me you did something more exciting than my trip to Home Depot with the wife. My daughter's birthday party, I said, not looking up from my computer screen. Ah, the famous Madeline. 24 now, right? Bet she's got her whole life figured out. These kids today, they're so confident about everything. Warren leaned against my desk, settling in for what he clearly expected to be a longer conversation. My nephew's the same age, thinks he's going to be a millionaire by 30. No respect for the process, you know? They all want the rewards without putting in the years. I murmured, still focused on my screen. Of course, I guess it's different when you've got family money to fall back on. Madeline's set up pretty well with your dad's trust, isn't she? Must be nice to have that safety net. I looked up at Warren then, really looked at him, and saw something I'd been missing in conversations like this for years. The assumption, the casual certainty that everyone in my life seemed to share about Madeline's future, about her place in the family, about what she was entitled to. We'll see, I said quietly. Warren laughed. What's that supposed to mean? You're not going to cut her off for being a typical 20-something, are you? Hell, I was probably worse at her age. I'm not cutting anyone off, Warren, but inheritance isn't automatic. There are requirements. Something in my tone must have registered because Warren's expression shifted slightly. Requirements? Legal requirements, specific criteria that beneficiaries have to meet. I turned back to my computer. Anyway, I should get back to work. The Morrison account needs attention. Warren lingered for another moment, clearly wanting to ask more questions, but eventually wandered off to bother someone else with his Monday morning observations. I made a mental note to be more careful about what I said around the office. Word traveled fast in our small company, and I didn't need gossip getting back to Madeline before I was ready. At lunch, I drove to First National Bank, where my father had established the family trust account. I'd been meaning to review the documents more carefully, and I wanted to speak with someone about the specific procedures for modifying beneficiary information. Margaret Henley, the trust officer who'd worked with my father for years, greeted me warmly when I arrived. Douglas, what a pleasant surprise. How's Madeline doing? She must be finished with college by now. She graduated last year. She's doing well. I settled into the chair across from Margaret's desk. Actually, that's part of why I'm here. I need to review the trust documentation, specifically the clauses regarding beneficiary eligibility. Margaret pulled up the account on her computer, her fingers clicking efficiently across the keyboard. Of course, let me refresh my memory on the specific terms your father established. She paused, reading. Yes, here it is. The trust specifies that beneficiaries must be direct biological descendants of Richard Carver, verified through appropriate documentation. It's actually quite specific language. Your father was very particular about that clause. What kind of documentation would be required for verification? DNA testing, typically. Birth certificates, of course, but those can be complicated in cases of adoption or unclear parentage. Your father insisted on the genetic requirement specifically to avoid any ambiguity. Margaret looked up from her screen. Is there some concern about Madeline's eligibility? I assumed since you adopted her. The adoption doesn't change her biological parentage, I said carefully. And my father was aware of that when he drafted the trust. Margaret's expression grew more serious. I see. Have you discussed this with Madeline? It could come as quite a shock if she's been expecting... She hasn't been expecting anything specific, I lied smoothly. But I want to make sure all our documentation is in order. What would be the process for updating beneficiary information if circumstances changed? Well, if a beneficiary were found to be ineligible under the trust terms, they would simply be removed from the distribution list. The assets would then pass to the next eligible beneficiary, or if there are none, the trust has provisions for charitable distribution. Margaret leaned forward slightly. Douglas, this is a substantial trust. If Madeline isn't eligible, that's a significant financial impact. Are you certain about this course of action? I'm certain about following the legal requirements my father established. That's all. Margaret nodded slowly, making notes in the file. I'll need formal documentation. The DNA test results you mentioned, along with a written request to update the beneficiary information. Once I have those, the changes can be processed within a few business days. And notification of beneficiaries? Not required unless they're being added to the trust. If someone is being removed due to ineligibility, there's no legal obligation to inform them until distribution time. Margaret's voice was carefully neutral, but I could see the questions in her eyes. Though many families choose to have those conversations privately. I'll handle any necessary conversations, I assured her. For now, I just want to understand the process. I left the bank with a clear understanding of exactly what I could do and when I could do it. The power had been in my hands all along. I'd just never had reason to use it before. That afternoon, I found myself at the coffee shop where Madeline and Brianna often met for their weekly gossip sessions. I hadn't planned to go there. I'd been driving aimlessly after the bank appointment and ended up in their neighborhood almost by accident. Or maybe not so accidentally. I ordered a coffee and found a table near the window, pulling out my laptop to review some work emails. I'd been there maybe 20 minutes when I heard familiar laughter from across the room. Madeline and Brianna had claimed a corner table, their conversation animated and loud enough that I couldn't help overhearing fragments. They were discussing the previous weekend's party, rehashing moments, and analyzing social media responses like political strategists reviewing an election. The photos got amazing engagement, Brianna was saying. Over 300 likes on the group shot, and the comments were so sweet. Everyone's talking about how gorgeous you looked. I know, right? And thank God we didn't have any awkward family drama to deal with. I was so worried Dad was going to do something embarrassing, but he actually behaved himself for once. He left early, though, didn't he? Yeah, which was honestly perfect. Like, I felt bad for maybe 5 seconds. But then I realized how much more relaxed everyone was after he was gone. Trevor said he was going to ask about filming at the party for his documentary thing, but he didn't want to deal with getting permission from parents and all that. Brianna laughed. Parents. God, can you imagine still needing permission for things at 24? You're so lucky you're basically independent now. Completely independent. Well, except for the trust fund situation, but that's different. That's not like asking for allowance. That's my inheritance. Grandpa Richard set that up specifically for me. When do you get access to it? I'm not totally sure. Dad handles all that stuff, but I think it's either when I turn 25 or when I get married, whichever comes first. Either way, it's not like he can take it away or anything. It's legally mine. I sat very still, my coffee growing cold in my hands as I listened to my daughter discuss her financial future with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to question her security. She had no idea how wrong she was about the legal protections she assumed were in place. How much are we talking about? Brianna asked, leaning forward conspiratorially. I don't know exactly, but Grandpa Richard was pretty successful. Dad always says it's enough that I won't have to worry about money if I'm smart about it. Probably enough to buy a house, maybe start a business, you know? Real financial freedom. That's amazing. You could literally do anything you want. I know. That's why I'm not stressed about the whole job thing like everyone else. I mean, I want to find something I'm passionate about, but I don't have to take the first crappy offer that comes along just to pay bills. I can be selective. They moved on to discussing other topics. Mutual friends, weekend plans, some drama involving Trevor and his ex-girlfriend. But I'd heard enough. Madeline had built her entire adult life around assumptions about her financial future that were completely false. She was making career decisions, lifestyle choices, maybe even relationship decisions based on security that didn't actually exist. And she'd done it all while treating me like an ATM and an embarrassment. Hours. I finished my coffee and left without them noticing I'd been there. On the drive home, I thought about the conversation I'd overheard and how it connected to everything else I'd learned about my daughter's true feelings over the past few days. She saw me as an obligation, a source of temporary funding until her real inheritance kicked in. She tolerated my presence at family events because it was socially expected, not because she valued our relationship, and she'd made all of this clear not just in private conversations, but publicly, on social media, for all her friends to see and validate. Back at my apartment, I went to the garage and pulled out the box of documents I'd retrieved from the old house. The DNA test results were there, along with copies of the original trust documentation and Madeline's birth certificate. I also found something I'd forgotten about, a letter from Franklin Black, Madeline's biological father, that had arrived about 5 years ago. Franklin had tracked us down somehow, writing from a correctional facility in Ohio where he was serving time for fraud and assault. The letter was rambling and largely incoherent, but it made clear that he knew about Madeline and was looking for money. I'd thrown the letter away at the time, but Sylvia had retrieved it from the trash, insisting we keep it just in case. Just in case of what? I'd wondered then. Now I was beginning to understand. I spread all the documents across my dining room table and took photos of each one with my phone. Then I made copies of everything, organizing the papers into neat folders: birth certificate, DNA results, trust documentation, Franklin's letter from prison. And at the bottom of the box, something I'd completely forgotten about. A background check I'd run on Franklin years ago, when Madeline was in high school and I'd been worried he might try to contact her directly. Franklin Black, age 60, currently serving his 7th term across various correctional institutions for offenses ranging from minor theft to serious physical attacks. Substance-related charges, repeated family abuse cases, financial schemes, a lifelong offender with no real interest in being a father beyond whatever benefit he could extract. This was Madeline's biological father. This was the man whose genes she carried, whose medical history she shared, whose legal claim to her was stronger than mine in the eyes of the law. My phone buzzed with a text from Madeline. "Hey, Dad, so excited about dinner this weekend. I made reservations at that new loft space downtown. It's supposed to be amazing. Saturday at 7? Really want to make up for last weekend. Love you." I read the message 3 times, noting the exclamation points and emoji, the enthusiastic tone that felt completely different from her usual brief, functional texts. This was damage control, an attempt to smooth over whatever guilt she felt about her behavior at the birthday party. She thought she could fix our relationship with one dinner, one performance of being a loving daughter, and then go back to treating me like a convenient ATM until her inheritance kicked in. I typed back, "Saturday at 7 sounds perfect. See you there?" But as I hit send, I was already planning what would actually happen at that dinner. Madeline wanted to make up for last weekend? Perfect. I'd give her an opportunity to understand exactly what last weekend had cost her. Tuesday morning, I called Ethan Foster's law office and scheduled an appointment for Thursday afternoon. His secretary, a brisk woman named Patricia, asked if I wanted to specify the nature of the consultation. "Family trust matters," I said, "and some questions about inheritance law. Mr. Foster has an opening at 2 o'clock on Thursday. Will that work for you?" Perfect. I spent the next 2 days organizing my documentation and researching the legal precedents for trust eligibility disputes. The internet is a remarkable resource when you know what questions to ask. I learned about genetic testing standards, legal notification requirements, and the specific language courts looked for in inheritance disputes. More importantly, I learned that my father's trust was ironclad. The biological descent requirement wasn't unusual or challengeable. It was a standard provision that had been upheld in countless similar cases. Madeline had no legal claim to the Carver family assets, and she never had. Thursday afternoon, I sat in Ethan's office with my folder of documents, watching him review everything with the careful attention he brought to all legal matters. Ethan was 48, methodical and precise, with a kind of measured personality that made him excellent at family law. He'd handled my divorce from Sylvia with professional competence and minimal drama, keeping the focus on practical arrangements rather than emotional grievances. "This is quite thorough, Douglas," he said finally, setting down the DNA test results. "You've had this information for 19 years?" "Yes. I had the test done when Madeline was 5, but it didn't seem relevant at the time. I was her father in every way that mattered." "And now?" I told him about the birthday party, about the social media posts, about the conversation I'd overheard at the coffee shop. Ethan listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on his legal pad. "So, this is about respect," he said when I finished, "about how you've been treated by your family." "This is about following the legal requirements my father established when he created the trust. Nothing more, nothing less. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. Douglas, I've known you for 15 years. I've seen you with Madeline at family gatherings, watched you prioritize her needs over your own countless times. This isn't just about legal requirements. You're right, I admitted. It's about understanding that love and sacrifice aren't enough if they're not reciprocated with basic human decency. Madeline has made it very clear how she sees me and what she thinks I'm worth to her. I'm simply accepting her assessment and acting accordingly. By removing her from the trust. By ensuring that only eligible beneficiaries receive distributions, as my father intended. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, reviewing the trust documents again. The language is very specific, he said finally. Direct biological descent, verified through genetic testing. There's no ambiguity here. What do I need to do to formalize the change? I'll need to prepare a formal notification to the trust administrator. That's Margaret Henley at First National, correct? Along with certified copies of the DNA results and a sworn affidavit regarding Madeline's parentage. Once that's submitted, she'll be removed from the beneficiary list within 5 business days. And notification to Madeline? Not legally required until distribution time, which could be years from now depending on the trust terms. Though, Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. Douglas, this will completely destroy your relationship with your daughter, and probably with Sylvia as well. Are you prepared for that? My relationship with Madeline is already destroyed. She's made that clear. I'm just acknowledging reality. What about the dinner this weekend? Are you planning to tell her then? I thought about that for a moment. I'm planning to let her know where things stand, yes. She's been operating under false assumptions about her future. It seems cruel to let that continue. Ethan made more notes, then looked up at me with something that might have been admiration or concern. You want me to prepare everything in advance? Have it ready to submit after your conversation with her? I want you to prepare everything now and submit it tomorrow. I want the changes processed before Saturday's dinner. Douglas, she's not my biological daughter, Ethan. She's not eligible for the trust. Those are facts, not emotions. I'm not punishing her. I'm simply correcting a misunderstanding that's gone on too long. Ethan nodded slowly. I'll have the paperwork ready by end of business tomorrow. But Douglas, once this is done, there's no taking it back. Even if you wanted to provide for Madeline in some other way later, the trust assets will be locked up in charitable distributions. You understand that? I understand perfectly. I left Ethan's office with a strange sense of lightness, as if I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't realized was there. For the first time in years, I was taking action instead of simply reacting to other people's choices. I was setting boundaries instead of absorbing disrespect and hoping things would improve. That evening, I sat in my apartment and composed a letter to accompany the legal documents Ethan would be preparing. I wrote several drafts, trying to find the right tone. Not angry or vindictive, but clear and factual. This wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. The final version was simple and direct. Madeline. After careful consideration, I have decided to update the beneficiary information for the Carver Family Trust to reflect the legal requirements established by your grandfather. Enclosed you will find documentation confirming that you are not my biological daughter, which makes you ineligible for distributions under the trust terms. Your biological father is Franklin Black, currently incarcerated at Marion Correctional Institution in Ohio. This decision is based solely on the legal criteria established in the trust documentation and is not subject to negotiation or appeal. I wish you well in your future endeavors. Douglas Carver. I read the letter 3 times, checking for any language that seemed emotional or personal. It was cold, yes, but it was also accurate. Madeline had spent years treating me like a legal formality rather than a father. Now she could experience what that actually meant. Friday morning, Ethan called to confirm that all the paperwork had been submitted to the bank and processed successfully. It's done, Douglas. Madeline has been removed from the trust as of this morning. Are you sure you want to go through with telling her tomorrow night? I'm sure. How are you planning to handle it? I thought about the elegant loft space Madeline had chosen for our dinner, the expensive restaurant she'd selected to assuage her guilt about the birthday party. I think I'll let the documentation speak for itself. What does that mean? It means I'm going to give her the letter and supporting documents at dinner. Let her read everything in front of her friends, if she's invited them. Let her understand the consequences of her choices in the same public way she chose to humiliate me. Douglas, that could be devastating for her. Yes, I agreed. It could be. Saturday afternoon, I prepared a manila envelope with copies of everything. The letter, the DNA test results, the trust documentation, Franklin Black's criminal record, and the bank confirmation that Madeline had been removed as a beneficiary. I also included printouts of her social media posts from the birthday party, highlighting the comments about the old man and her regret about inviting me. I wanted her to see the complete picture, not just the legal consequences of her parentage, but the connection between her treatment of me and the loss of her assumed inheritance. She'd spent years taking my love and support for granted, while publicly dismissing me as an embarrassment and a burden. Now she could learn what life looked like without that safety net. The envelope was thick, heavy with documentation and consequences. I wrote Madeline's name across the front in my careful handwriting, then sealed it and set it by the door. Tomorrow night, my daughter would finally understand exactly who she was and what she was entitled to. She'd learn the truth about her biological father, about the trust she'd been counting on, about the legal reality that had been hidden beneath 24 years of love and sacrifice. And she'd learn it all in the same public, humiliating way she'd chosen to dismiss me at her birthday party. I felt no guilt about the timing or the method. Madeline was an adult who had made adult choices about how to treat the people in her life. She deserved to understand the adult consequences of those choices. The envelope sat by my door like a loaded weapon, waiting for tomorrow night's dinner and the moment when everything would finally be made clear. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that makes everything seem sharper, more defined. I woke up early, made coffee, and sat at my dining room table with the manila envelope containing Madeline's future. Or rather, the absence of the future she'd been expecting. I'd slept better than I had in months. There was something profoundly peaceful about finally taking action after years of passive acceptance. No more wondering if things would improve, no more hoping that Madeline would eventually appreciate the sacrifices I'd made for her. The uncertainty was over. At 9 o'clock, I called a courier service I'd found online that specialized in timed deliveries for special events. The woman who answered was cheerfully professional, clearly accustomed to handling unusual requests. "I need an envelope delivered to a specific location at a specific time," I explained. "The timing is crucial." "Absolutely, sir. What's the delivery address and preferred time?" I gave her the address of the loft space downtown where Madeline had made our dinner reservation. "I need it delivered at exactly 8 o'clock this evening. The recipient's name is Madeline Carver, and she'll be hosting a private dinner party." "No problem at all. We handle a lot of special event deliveries, birthday surprises, anniversary gifts, that sort of thing. Is there anything specific you'd like our courier to say when making the delivery?" I thought about that for a moment. "Have them say it's from her father and that she should open it right away. Tell them it contains important family information that can't wait." "Perfect. We'll have someone there at 8 sharp. And sir, we guarantee our timing. If there are any issues with the delivery, you won't be charged." "Thank you. That's exactly what I need." After arranging the courier, I drove to the bank to make one final withdrawal from my personal account. If Madeline tried to contact me after tonight asking for money, which seemed likely once she understood her situation, I wanted to be in a position to refuse without any ambiguity. I closed my savings account and transferred most of my checking account balance to a new account at a different bank, one where Madeline had no access or history. Margaret Henley was working Saturday hours and greeted me when I came in to finalize the trust paperwork. "Everything has been processed, Douglas. Madeline is no longer listed as a beneficiary, and the trust assets are now designated for charitable distribution upon your passing, as specified in the original documentation. And there's no way to reverse this decision? Not without proof that she is your biological daughter, which would contradict the DNA evidence you provided. The trust language is very specific about genetic requirements." "Good. That's exactly what I wanted to confirm." Margaret hesitated, then spoke more quietly. "Douglas, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I've been managing family trusts for 20 years. I've seen situations like this before. Families torn apart by money and legal technicalities. Sometimes the financial consequences are less important than the emotional damage. Are you certain this is the path you want to take?" "I'm certain that I want to honor my father's wishes and follow the legal requirements he established. Everything else is secondary." Margaret nodded, though I could see the concern in her eyes. "Very well. Is there anything else you need from me today?" "Just confirmation that if Madeline contacts you directly asking about the trust, you'll refer her to the legal documentation rather than discussing specifics." "That's standard policy anyway. Trust information is only shared with authorized parties." I left the bank feeling like I'd closed the final door on 24 years of unreciprocated devotion. The practical arrangements were complete. Now all that remained was the revelation itself. I spent the afternoon at my apartment, cleaning and organizing with the methodical focus of a man preparing for a significant change. I wasn't sure what would happen after tonight's dinner, but I suspected my life would look very different starting tomorrow. Madeline would likely try to contact me, Either to argue about the trust decision or to demand an explanation, Sylvia would certainly have opinions about my actions. There might be legal threats, emotional manipulation, attempts to guilt me into reversing my decision. I was prepared for all of it. At 6 o'clock, I drove downtown to the area near the loft space where Madeline had made our dinner reservation. I wasn't planning to attend the dinner. That had never been my intention. Instead, I found a parking spot across the street from the building and waited. The loft space was on the third floor of a converted warehouse with large windows that provided a clear view of the interior. I could see staff setting up tables and arranging flowers, preparing for what was clearly an upscale dining experience. Madeline had chosen well if her goal was to impress. The space looked sophisticated and expensive, exactly the kind of place a young woman would select to demonstrate her refined taste and social status. At 7:15, I watched Madeline arrive in an Uber, looking stunning in a navy blue dress I'd never seen before. She was clearly excited, checking her phone and looking around with the anticipation of someone who believed she was about to repair a damaged relationship through the simple act of buying an expensive dinner. A few minutes later, Sylvia arrived, followed by Brianna and Trevor. So this wasn't just a father-daughter reconciliation dinner. It was a performance, staged in front of the same audience that had witnessed my humiliation at the birthday party. Perfect. I watched them settle at a large table near the windows, saw Madeline checking her watch and looking toward the entrance, obviously wondering where I was. She'd probably texted me by now, but I'd turned off my phone an hour ago. I wanted her to experience the uncertainty, the growing realization that something wasn't going according to plan. At 8 o'clock exactly, I saw a courier enter the building carrying a manila envelope. I watched him speak to the hostess, who pointed toward Madeline's table. The courier approached the group, spoke briefly with Madeline, and handed her the envelope. Even from across the street, I could see the confusion on her face as she looked at the envelope with her name written across the front. She said something to the others at the table, probably explaining that it was from me, and then opened the envelope while her dinner companions watched with curious expressions. I saw her pull out the letter and begin reading. I saw her expression change from confusion to shock to something that looked like panic. I watched her hands shake as she rifled through the other documents in the envelope. The DNA results, the trust paperwork, Franklin Black's criminal record. Brianna leaned over to read over Madeline's shoulder, and I saw her face go pale. Trevor was asking questions, reaching for some of the papers. Sylvia was trying to read the letter while Madeline clutched it with trembling hands. The table erupted in urgent, animated conversation. Madeline was crying now, holding up the DNA test results and shaking her head. Brianna had her phone out, probably trying to call me. Sylvia was gesturing angrily, clearly demanding to see all the documentation. I watched the scene unfold with the detached calm of someone observing a scientific experiment. This was what truth looked like when it finally emerged after years of comfortable lies and assumptions. This was what happened when actions met consequences, when legal reality collided with emotional expectations. Madeline stood up suddenly, still clutching the papers, and I could see her mouth moving rapidly as she spoke to the others. She was probably trying to explain, to rationalize, to find some way to make sense of what she'd just learned about her parentage and her future. But there was nothing to explain. The documentation was clear, comprehensive, and legally binding. She was not my daughter. She was not eligible for the trust. Her biological father was a career criminal. And her assumed inheritance, the financial security she'd been counting on, the safety net that had allowed her to treat me with casual disrespect, had never existed. I started my car and drove away, leaving Madeline to process the complete destruction of everything she'd believed about her identity and her future. I didn't need to see the rest of the scene. I'd accomplished what I'd come to do. 24 years of fatherhood had ended not with a conversation or an argument, but with an envelope full of documents and the simple, devastating truth they contained. Madeline had wanted to make up for the birthday party humiliation with this dinner. Instead, she'd received something far more educational, a comprehensive understanding of exactly what she'd lost through her years of taking me for granted. The old man had indeed changed his mind, and unlike her casual dismissal of me at the birthday party, this change was permanent, legal, and irreversible. The courier had delivered the envelope exactly as instructed, approaching the table with professional courtesy and identifying himself to the hostess before making his way to where Madeline sat with her carefully curated dinner party. I'd watched from across the street as he handed her the manila envelope, his words audible even from my distant vantage point. "Ms. Carver, this is from your father. He asked me to tell you it contains important family information that should be opened right away." Madeline had taken the envelope with a confused smile, probably assuming it was some kind of apology gift or sentimental gesture meant to accompany my late arrival. She'd shown it to the others at the table, Sylvia, Brianna, Trevor, and 2 other friends I didn't recognize, explaining that it was from me while she worked to open the sealed flap. "He's always so formal about everything," I'd heard Brianna say with a laugh, her voice carrying through the large windows of the loft space. "Probably wrote you some long letter about how sorry he is for being weird at your birthday party." "That would be so like him," Madeline had replied, sliding the thick stack of papers from the envelope. "He probably spent hours crafting the perfect apology and—" Her words had stopped abruptly as she'd unfolded my letter and begun to read the opening lines. I'd watched her face change from amused expectation to confusion to something approaching horror as the meaning of the words became clear. "After careful consideration, I have decided to update the beneficiary information for the Carver Family Trust to reflect the legal requirements established by your grandfather." "What does it say?" Sylvia had asked, leaning forward to try to read over Madeline's shoulder. Madeline's hands had begun to shake as she'd continued reading, her voice dropping to a whisper as she'd reached the second paragraph. "Enclosed you will find documentation confirming that you are not my biological daughter, which makes you ineligible for distributions under the trust terms." "What?" Brianna had grabbed for the letter, her perfectly manicured nails flashing as she tried to see what had caused such a dramatic reaction. "Madeline, what is he talking about?" But Madeline had been rifling through the other documents in the envelope now, pulling out papers with shaking hands and spreading them across the white tablecloth like evidence at a crime scene. The DNA test results came first: official laboratory letterhead, detailed genetic analysis, and the unmistakable conclusion that Douglas Carver was not the biological father of Madeline Carver. "This can't be right," Madeline had whispered, staring at the test results. "This has to be some kind of mistake. He's my dad. He's always been my dad." Trevor had reached for one of the papers, scanning the technical language with the same confusion everyone else was displaying. "These look official, Madeline. Like really official. When did he have this test done?" The answer was right there on the documentation. The test had been conducted 19 years ago when Madeline was 5 years old. For 19 years, I'd known the truth about her parentage and had chosen to keep loving her, supporting her, being her father in every way that mattered. And for the last several years, she'd chosen to treat me like an embarrassing obligation and a convenient source of funding. Sylvia had grabbed the trust documentation next, her face going pale as she'd read the specific language about biological descent requirements. "Douglas never told me about this clause," she'd said, her voice tight with panic. "He never said anything about genetic requirements for the inheritance." "What inheritance?" one of the friends had asked, clearly lost in the rapidly unfolding family drama. "My grandfather's trust," Madeline had explained, her voice hollow. "It's supposed to. I thought it was going to. There's supposed to be money for me when I turn 25, or when I get married, or—" She'd trailed off, the reality of her situation beginning to sink in, but the worst revelation was still to come. Brianna had found Franklin Black's criminal record in the pile of papers, and her gasp had drawn everyone's attention to the document that identified Madeline's actual biological father. "Franklin Black," Brianna read aloud, her voice climbing with each line. "Currently held at Marion Correctional Institution, serving time for serious physical offenses and financial misconduct. Prior convictions include repeated family abuse cases, substance-related charges, and theft." She looked up at Madeline, eyes wide. "This is your real father?" The table erupted with shocked murmurs and urgent questions. How long had I known? Why reveal this now? What did it mean for Madeline's future? But the most damaging papers were still at the bottom of the envelope, printouts of Madeline's own social media posts from her birthday party. "Oh my God," Trevor said, scanning the screenshots of her Instagram comments. "Madeline, did you really write this? Looks like the old man changed his mind. Shouldn't have invited him at all." Madeline had snatched the printouts from his hands, her face flushing red as she'd seen her own words reflected back at her. I was frustrated that night. I didn't mean—" "Ignore him, keep dancing," Sylvia had read from Brianna's comment. "And your response? Already regretting that choice." "Madeline, how could you write something like that about your father?" "He's not my father," Madeline had exploded, gesturing wildly at the DNA results. "Apparently he's not my father, and he never was. This whole thing is insane. 24 years of lying to me about who I am." But even as she'd said it, the logical part of her mind had been working through the timeline. The DNA test was 19 years old. I'd known the truth since she was 5, and I'd continued to raise her, love her, support her through everything. I'd paid for her education, her car, her apartment. I'd been there for every milestone, every achievement, every crisis, and she'd repaid that devotion by treating me like an ATM and publicly dismissing me as an embarrassment. The bank confirmation letter had been the final blow. official documentation that Madeline Carver had been removed as a beneficiary from the Richard Carver Family Trust, effective immediately. The money she'd been counting on, the financial security that had allowed her to be selective about job offers and casual about her treatment of me, was gone. "This is dated yesterday," Sylvia had said, reading the bank letter with growing horror. "He already did it. He already removed her from the trust." "Can he do that?" Brianna had asked. "Can he just take away her inheritance like that?" "It's not her inheritance," Trevor had pointed out, reading through the trust documentation. "Look at this language. It specifically requires biological descent from Richard Carver. If she's not Douglas's biological daughter, then she was never eligible in the first place." The reality of the situation had settled over the table like a toxic cloud. Madeline had spent her entire adult life assuming she had a substantial inheritance waiting for her. She'd made career decisions, lifestyle choices, and relationship judgments based on that assumed security. And now, in the space of 5 minutes, she'd learned that not only was the money gone, but it had never been legally hers to begin with. "Where is he?" Madeline had demanded, looking around the restaurant as if I might materialize from behind a pillar. "Why isn't he here? Why did he send this with a courier instead of telling me himself?" The answer was obvious to everyone at the table, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. I wasn't there because I was done. Done with the disrespect, done with the casual cruelty, done with being treated like a convenient source of funding rather than a human being who deserved basic consideration. "Try calling him," Sylvia had suggested, but Madeline's attempts had gone straight to voicemail. My phone was off, and it would stay off. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no opportunity for manipulation or emotional blackmail, no chance for Madeline to argue her way back into my good graces or the family trust. "He planned this," Brianna had said, her voice filled with a mixture of admiration and horror. "He knew exactly what he was doing. The timing, the location, the way he delivered everything. This was calculated." She was right. Every detail had been carefully orchestrated to maximize the impact of the revelation. Madeline had wanted to make up for her birthday party humiliation with this dinner, surrounding herself with the same friends who had witnessed and encouraged her disrespectful treatment of me. Now, those same friends were witnessing the complete destruction of everything she'd believed about her identity and her future. The papers lay scattered across the white tablecloth like debris from an explosion. DNA results proving I wasn't her biological father, criminal records showing what kind of man actually was, trust documentation explaining why she'd never been legally entitled to the inheritance she'd been counting on, bank confirmations showing that her removal from the trust was already complete and irreversible, and underneath it all, the printouts of her own social media posts, her own words proving exactly how little she'd valued the man who had chosen to love her as his daughter for 24 years. "What am I supposed to do now?" Madeline had whispered, staring at the pile of documents that had just redefined her entire existence. "The job interviews I turned down because I thought I could wait for something